Well, thank you, Rainer, for all those kind words. It is a very strange feeling for me to hear the words I wrote read out today. They're true words. It takes me back to that extraordinary experience. But first of all, let me say what an honor it is to be here, how honored I felt to be asked to be patron of your new institute, and to see all of you here this afternoon. I'm really sorry I can't speak to you in German, but I never could learn languages. I did spend some time in Germany, but the family I was with was so determined to learn English that they wouldn't let me speak German at all. So I want to bring another language here, though. I want to start off by bringing the voice of the animal I know best, the being whom I know best, into this space. Because so often we actually forget the animal beings we're speaking about. We talk of them, but we're not thinking who they are. So here simply is a greeting that you would hear if you came with me to Gombe National Park in Tanzania, where for almost 50 years we've been studying one group of chimpanzees. And we owe this group of chimpanzees a lot in our gradual understanding of the theme that Rainer's been talking about. And this is the sound you would hear in the morning as a chimpanzee on one side of a beautiful valley is calling out, wanting to know if there's anyone on the other side. It's the greeting. It just means, hello, I'm here. Who's out there? And I bring this sound on purpose. I take it around the world because it brings people to a different level of feeling, I think. Actually, we can imagine being out in the forest if we hear a sound like that. It can take us away from this room, beautiful as it is, into a more natural world, the world that I love, the world which has given me experiences such as the one Rainer read out to you today. But to develop this theme, and the reason I'm here, I want to explain very briefly how chimpanzees have played such an important role in my life, in my understanding, in the development of my own feeling for who we are as human beings on this amazing planet. Looking back over these 50 years, I'm impressed again and again by just how much we've learned about the chimpanzees, and from it we've realized how like us they are, or how like them we are. And it's not only the results from the research at Gombe in Tanzania, it's also subsequently other scientists, other biologists have gone out into the field learning more and more about chimpanzees in different areas. And scientists working with captive chimpanzees have learned more and more about how like us their biology is. The DNA of chimpanzees and humans differs by only just over 1%. Just over 1%. The blood is so like ours that we could get a blood transfusion from a chimpanzee if we match the blood group. The immune system is so similar that they can catch or be infected with all known human contagious diseases. More fascinating for me, the brain is so similar in its anatomy. It's just a little bit smaller in the chimpanzee. Not surprising then that the intellectual abilities of these chimpanzees are so similar to ours, that they can do things intellectually we used to think only humans could do. And we find also there are amazing similarities in the social behavior as well. The first real major breakthrough I made out in the field in 1960 was seeing a chimpanzee pick a piece of grass and use it as a tool. And then seeing him reach out and pick a leafy twig and strip the leaves, he was making a tool. At that time, it was thought that only human beings used and made tools, and we were defined as man the tool maker. So that when my mentor, Louis Leakey, heard about these observations, he said, now we must redefine man, redefine tool, or accept chimpanzees as humans. Well, if we look at, for example, how do they communicate? They have many calls, such as the one that I demonstrated, but they also communicate with what we might call body language, and kissing, embracing, holding hands, patting on the back, swaggering, throwing rocks, waving branches, laughing. These things they do in the same context we do, and clearly they mean the same kind of thing. The relationship between family members. Chimpanzees can live to be over 60 years. And the bonds, the affectionate, supportive bonds between mothers and offspring and between brothers and sisters are amazingly strong and can last throughout life. The father, well, there's no lasting pair bonds between adult males and females, but the males in general act as fathers to all the infants in their community, and they patrol the boundaries of their territory and protect the resources for their own females and young. The bonds between family members are so strong that if a mother dies, an older child will adopt a little orphan. And if that child is old enough to survive without the mother's milk, then the older brother or sister may actually save the life of the infant. But they're dependent on their mother's milk for 3 years. It's a very long childhood. And in that childhood, the chimpanzees learn, just as our children learn, by observing, by practicing. And we know now that in all different parts of Africa where chimps have been studied, they show different tool-using behaviors. The young ones learn from the adults. So we can describe these as a kind of primitive culture. It was a big shock to find that chimpanzees are capable of violence and brutality, and even a kind of primitive war, that one community totally annihilated another, only sparing the adolescent females and trying to recruit them. It sounds very human. It was shocking to me to realize that learning about this violence made them seem even more like us than I'd thought before. That's a sad commentary on our own species, but for me it was true. But we have to take heart from the fact that while they may show a dark side just like us, they also show love, compassion, and true altruism. So if we have indeed inherited some tendencies from our ancient primate past, which we believe, if we believe in evolution, then yes, perhaps violence, aggression, war has been part of our evolutionary pathway, but then so too has love, compassion, and altruism. And it seems to me that within each one of us, there are these two sides warring, and it's up to each one of us to fight to suppress the one and develop the other. It's very clear, looking back over these 50 years, that we humans are not the only beings with personality, mind, and feeling, that there is no sharp line between us and the rest of the natural world. The things that you were talking about, Rainer, that in the olden days, people understood this. In many Eastern philosophies, they've continued to feel that way. With the indigenous people, it's all the brothers and sisters that St. Francis talked about. But we've moved away from that in the Western world and made this division. And the chimpanzees are helping science to realize that that division between us and them is not a real division at all. There's no sharp line, it's a blurry line. Do you know, when I began the chimpanzee study, I had no degree of any sort. I had not been to college. But Louis Leakey told me I had to get a degree. I had to stand on my own 2 feet to be able to get my own money. And so he got me a position in Cambridge University, but not to do a BA, to go straight for a PhD. He said, there's no time to mess with a BA. So I was a bit nervous when I got to Cambridge, but excited. I wanted to learn about science. And so it was a shock to be told by the professors that I'd done everything wrong. I shouldn't have given the chimpanzees names. They should have had numbers. That was more scientific. I shouldn't talk about chimpanzees having personalities or minds capable of thinking, or, above all, emotions, because those were unique to us, the human animal. Wasn't it strange that the scientists who were investigating human disease, including disease of the mind, were using chimpanzees to try and find out more about these diseases which other animals less like us couldn't catch? But they were completely unprepared to admit that as well as physical similarities, there were also these intellectual and emotional similarities. And that was the big fight I had, to try and get it accepted that animals do indeed have personalities, minds, and feelings. When I got to Cambridge and was being confronted by these erudite scientists, and I knew nothing about science really, I don't know if I would have been able to stand up to these professors, but for two things. One, a very, very wise mother. And she had always taught me that if somebody disagrees with your opinion, the first thing you must do is listen. Very carefully listen, and then rethink your own position in light of what you've heard. But if you still feel that you're right, or as right as you can be, then you must have the courage of your conviction. So that was one thing. But the other, more powerful, was that while I was a child, I had a wonderful teacher. A teacher who taught me absolutely animals have personalities, and certainly they have minds, and absolutely they have emotions and feelings. And that teacher was my dog, Rusty. I think that any of us who shared our lives in a meaningful way with a dog or a cat, a rabbit, a guinea pig, a horse, a cow, a donkey, or animals in the zoo, we know that it's true that animals do have personalities, minds, and feelings, that they deserve names, that they are not mere things put into this world for our pleasure, to use and abuse as we wish, but they are beings in their own right, with their own personalities, minds, and feelings. So that was what I learned from the chimpanzees, and they helped me to go out and talk about animals in this way, because they gave me such wonderful proof that I was right. And the more we've learned about them, the more it's become very obvious, even to some of the very hardened scientists, that they were wrong, that animals do matter in a different way. And the main pockets of resistance are from those people who are doing invasive, cruel studies on animals, or are involved in the business of intensive farming animals for food, or other cruel practices of this sort. However, we've talked a lot about similarities between chimpanzees and humans, and we must also think about differences. And to me, the main difference is the explosive development of the human intellect. I mean, yes, chimpanzees can do things we never thought they could do. They can recognize themselves in mirrors. They can learn the signs used by deaf people, American Sign Language, ASL. They can learn 400 or more of these signs and use them to communicate with each other as well as with their teacher. They can do all kinds of amazing things with computers. It's staggering what they can do, but you can't compare even the brightest chimpanzee with an average human being when it comes to intellectual ability. And just think what we've done with our amazing brains. We've sent people to the moon. We've got medical technology that has saved the lives of hundreds of people. It's pretty sad that we've also used our brains for weapons of mass destruction, but we have a brain that is capable of being turned to good, and in many cases has been turned to good. And if we think of the literature and the art, the music, all of these things are a testimony to what mankind is capable of. So how has our intellect developed so fast compared to that of a chimpanzee or any other creature. I think it's this language. We're using English, German, and with this language, if we understand each other, we can have a discussion. We can bring together people who have different understanding about the world around them to try and solve a problem. And each person will bring their own wisdom to bear. We can teach our children about things that aren't present. If I had time, I could tell you stories of Gombe, and you would imagine you were there because of the way that we can use words to paint pictures and to evoke feelings and emotions in other people who listen. So here we are with this highly developed intellect, and yet we're destroying our only planet. We seem to have lost wisdom, the wisdom of the indigenous people who would make a decision based on how does this decision we make today affect our people in the future. And now we're making decisions based on how does the decision I make now affect me, or the next shareholders meeting 3 months ahead, or my political career. These are the kind of criteria we're using. And so poor old planet Earth is suffering. And as you heard, I just was in Copenhagen, where people are arguing about how can we save this planet from the gradual change of climate, a change in climate which we see everywhere, affecting animal species, plunging millions of people into poverty, creating refugees. So what a strange mixture we humans are. And a lot of the thoughts that I've had about human nature have come from comparing us to the only other creature that is similar in so many ways, the chimpanzee, and how we've developed beyond it. So as years went by, and we found more and more characteristics in chimpanzees that we thought unique to us, people were always asking questions, wanting to make us different. There's a huge desire on the part of many people, whether it's religion or science, to make sure that we do occupy a unique position on this planet. So, well, what about death? Do chimpanzees bury their dead? No, they don't. Do they mourn? Yes, they do. They show deep depression. And in fact, a young child may actually die when the mother dies, even though that child is capable of living on solid foods. It seems their world is shattered when they lose their mother. They lose the will to live, they become depressed, and they may actually die. So, yes, chimpanzees understand the difference between life and death. So then people began asking, what about religion? And that's where we come back to the story that we began with. Out in the forests in Gombe, there are some very beautiful waterfalls. One in particular, the water drops 80 feet. It's a very narrow stream. But over hundreds of years, that falling water has carved a deep channel in the rock, so that as the water falls and moves the air, the ferns at the side growing up the rocks are waving and the vines are hanging down. And there's a roaring sound that you hear as you get closer. And sometimes you see chimpanzees, as they approach, their hair starts standing on end with excitement. And as they get close, they start an amazing kind of dance, very rhythmic. And they're swaying from side to side, and they'll pick up big boulders in the stream bed and throw them and stamp in the water. And maybe this may last for 20 minutes, 20 whole minutes, and they may climb the little vines up beside the water and push out into the spray. And then sometimes at the end, if you're lucky enough to see their eyes, they'll sit on a rock, and you see them watching this water coming, going. What is it? What is this seemingly live thing that's always coming and always going, but always here? And I can't help feeling that the chimpanzees are experiencing something similar to the wonder and awe that I've always felt out in nature. The sort of feelings perhaps that led to the early animistic religions, the worship of the water, the worship of the sun, the things that the early humans couldn't understand. And because these early humans had language, they could discuss their feelings, and that could lead to some of the earliest ritual kind of religious practices. But the chimpanzees may have these feelings, but they're trapped within. They can't talk about them. They can imitate each other. They can catch excitement from each other, but that's different. And so if they do have a sense of religion, it's trapped within them. Do they have a soul? That was the next question. Well, we can't prove that we have souls. Probably a large percentage of us in this room believe that we have souls, or we hope that we have souls. And all the months and years that I've spent on my own out in the forest, where all life is interwoven, which is giving one a sense of timelessness, that these trees, these very trees, were growing there when Christ walked on the planet. And so lost my thread of thought there. So anyway, they're out in the forest having this sense of wonder, sense of awe, sense of timelessness, as Rainer read out, losing all sense of self out there in the forest, one's own ego. It's not important. You don't remember yourself. If you're with somebody else, you know you're human. If you're alone, you forget you're human, and you have this feeling of oneness with nature. And as I got more and more in tune with this wonderful natural world, with its rain, its storms, the beautiful lake, the sunrises, the sunsets, I felt so strongly this great spiritual power all around. I think in which we live and move and have our being is a wonderful expression. And my mother taught us, me and my sister, she was very wise. She taught us that wherever we were born in the world, we would worship a god, and the god would have different names. It might be Allah, it might be Tao, it might be God. But she said, you know, there's one God. There can only be one God. If we believe in God, there's one God. So whatever name we give God, it's the same God that we worship. So that was how she taught me when I was a child. And there I was out in the forest, surrounded by this great spiritual power, which I call God, but other people may call something different. And I got the feeling more and more that every living thing in this beautiful forest had a spark of this divine spiritual power within. And we have this language. We've developed our intellect. And so we ask ourselves, who am I? Why am I here? What is the meaning of life? And feeling this spark of the divine within, we've given it a name. We call it a soul. And I believe that the chimpanzees, the other creatures, also have this spark of the divine. They don't care whether it's called a soul or whatever. They just get on with being. They get on with being part of this natural world. They don't question it. And you know, it's probably true that these ancient trees, these wonderful life forms, they must have a spark of the divine as well. It's this feeling of unity that I found in the forests, and I found it on the Great Plains, and I felt it when I'm out at sea. But you feel it so much more when you're alone. I felt it in some of the great cathedrals, this sense of wonder and awe at what we humans are capable of. But it hasn't given me the same feeling of oneness with the universe as I get out in the forest. So I wanted to end up with a story. It's moving out of the spiritual realm. It's a story of real life that happened, but it is very much connected to the theme that we're talking about, animals and humans. I think that the idea of this institute that Rainer had is wonderful. I think there is so much need to share our knowledge of what animals are and can do for us with a wide variety of people as possible, religion, science. Huge controversy about religion and science. I've never felt it. I don't feel there's any problem at all in believing in evolution and believing in God. I've never felt that. At any rate, Rainer and I were talking earlier today about how animals can help us in so many ways, and we're beginning to learn how valuable they can be, how they can help sick people, old people, watch people change. I wish there was a dog in here. It would change the atmosphere. I could give a chimpanzee a call, but if there was a dog here, you see them all warmed up even at the thought of having a dog here. I've watched rooms change when a dog comes in. I invited a blind friend of mine to the United Nations when I had to give a talk so that I could actually invite my blind friend up, and he had his guide dog. So that was my way of getting a dog up into this gathering. And everybody was smiling. So autistic children can learn to read if they're talking to a dog because they know the dog won't laugh at them, but they believe the dog can understand them. And so they learn to read much better than any other way. Dogs can sniff out landmines. Dogs are sniffing out drugs. Dogs and other animals are helping us in so many ways. So we need to help the animals. They are having a bad time, whether it's in our intensive farms or our fur farms or the puppy mills, badly treated pets, the cruel training of animals in circuses. We could go on and on with the list of the harm that we do to animals. I could talk for a long time about animals moving towards extinction, but I could also talk about the amazing people who are helping them. So this last story is about a chimpanzee who was born in Africa. His mother was shot when he was about 1.5. You cannot take a baby chimp from the wild unless you kill the mother, or at least anesthetize her, because they're so protective. And he was sent to a medical research lab in the United States, 5 foot by 5 foot cage, 7 foot high. He was in there for about 20 years. And then he was one of the lucky ones. They didn't need him anymore for the experiments he'd been involved with. They realized that after all, chimpanzees weren't useful in this kind of research, that like us they may be, but they're not the same. And so he was released and put into a zoo on a man-made island. And with him were 3 females, 2 from a lab, 1 from a circus. He was named Old Man when he arrived because even though he arrived as a tiny infant, when an infant is depressed, they hunch and huddle up and their little faces are so lined and they look like little old men or women. So he was called Old Man. And there he is on his man-made island, surrounded by a moat because chimpanzees don't swim. And a young man was employed to look after these chimps, Mark. He was told, don't go anywhere near them. They hate people. They're vicious. They're much stronger than you. They can kill you. So Mark was taking the food and throwing it onto the island from a little boat. And he started to watch them. A baby was born. Old Man had a baby. And Mark watched how Old Man loved this child and would share food, would carry it around and try and protect it from real or imagined danger. He saw how when he approached with food, these chimpanzees were so filled with joy that before they even took a bite, they would kiss and hug and give squeaks of sheer pleasure before they began to eat. And he started to think, how can I care for these amazing beings if I don't have some kind of relationship with them? So he began going a little bit closer and a little bit closer. And one day he held out a banana in his hand, and Old Man took it. And he said to me, Jane, I know how you felt when David Greybeard, that was my first chimp who lost his fear of me, I know how you felt when David Greybeard first took a banana from you. And one day Mark dared to step onto the shore of the island, and nothing happened. Nobody hurt him. And Old Man seemed to be quite friendly. So one day Mark dared go up and groom him, chimpanzees spend hours grooming each other. And one day, Old Man groomed him back. And one day, Mark dared to tickle in his ticklish neck, and Old Man began to laugh. They became friends. The females kept away, but they never harmed Mark, until one day, it had been raining. Mark slipped. He fell flat on his face. He startled the infant who was nearby. The infant screamed. The mother reacted, as chimpanzee mothers do. She raced over, thinking Mark had hurt her precious child, and bit deeply into his neck. And the other two females ran over to help their friend. One bit his wrist and one bit his leg. He's bleeding. He is still lying flat on the ground. He looks up, wondering how he can escape. And now he sees Old Man charging across with his hair bristling and his lips bunched in a furious scowl. And Mark thinks I've hurt his precious child, and he prepared to die. But what happened? Old Man pulled each of those females away. He kept them away, screamed and roused as they were, while Mark managed to drag himself to his boat and safety. And I met Mark when he came out of hospital some months later. And he said, "Jane, there's no question, Old Man saved my life." And to me, this is very symbolic. If a chimpanzee who has been horribly abused by people can reach out across this non-existent gap between us and the rest of the animals to help a human friend in time of need, then surely we, with our greater capacity for compassion and understanding, can do the same for the animals in their time of need. And so this is why this institute is so important, because this is the kind of message that we need to get out into the religious communities as well as into the scientific communities, so that we can get together and use these God-given brains and reach into our hearts and try and make a difference, not only for the animals, but for our own children and the unborn generations to come. So thank you, Rainer, and thank you.